The bullet that killed Inez Lawson's father missed her by less than 2 inches, and it was the echo of that shot that sent her riding hard across the Texas panhandle on the coldest morning of 1883, with nothing but a saddlebag full of grief and a letter she had not yet decided whether to open. She had been in Amarillo for 3 weeks when the trouble started. The Lawson homestead sat on the edge of a broad stretch of grassland that her father, Harold Lawson, had built into something worth keeping over the course of 20 years. He had driven cattle up from the south, fenced the land with his own hands, and raised Inez on stories about the dignity of honest work. He was a broad-shouldered man with a careful voice, and he had died on a Tuesday morning when 2 riders from the Caldwell Land Consortium had decided that his refusal to sell was no longer a negotiation they were willing to tolerate. Inez was 23 years old, and she was alone. She had a cousin in a town called Harlan Creek, a small settlement 3 days' ride to the southwest, nestled between 2 ridges where a thin river bent around a stand of cottonwoods. She had never been there, but her father had mentioned it in his letters before she had come home from the school in Fort Worth, and it seemed like the only direction that made any kind of sense. The letter in her saddlebag was from the Harlan Creek Land Registry, sent to her father before his death. It outlined his purchase of a small piece of property just outside the town, 20 acres and a house, hers now if she could get to it. She rode through the second day under a sky the color of old iron, the wind pressing against her from the northwest with a persistence that felt personal. Her horse, a sturdy roan mare named Calla, moved steadily despite the cold. Inez had wrapped herself in her father's canvas duster, which was too large for her shoulders but carried his smell still, something like cedar and tobacco, and she kept her chin low and her eyes on the horizon. She crossed the Canadian River at a shallow ford near dusk on the second day and found a small camp made by a group of cattle drovers working their way north. They were civil men, older and weathered, and they let her share their fire without making her feel like a problem to be solved. She told them she was headed to Harlan Creek, and one of them, a man with a white mustache and sun-ruined skin, said he knew it. "Good town," he said. "Got a decent blacksmith, a doctor who ain't drunk most of the time, and a sheriff who actually does the job. A man named Thatcher runs the livery there. August Thatcher. Fair man. If you need anything when you ride in, he would be the one to find." She thanked him and said little else, and in the morning she was back on Calla before the drovers had finished their coffee. Harlan Creek appeared to her on the afternoon of the third day like something she had imagined and then forgotten and was only now remembering. The town sat quietly in its valley, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys in thin white columns that bent sideways in the wind. There was a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a church at the northern end, a row of storefronts, a hotel, and down near the livery, a water trough that Calla smelled before she saw it. Inez let the mare drink and looked around her at the town. People moved along the boardwalks with the unhurried rhythm of a place that had settled into itself. A woman in a blue dress was sweeping the steps of a dry goods store. 2 boys were arguing over a hoop in the dirt. A dog slept under a bench outside the barber shop. She became aware of someone standing beside her before she actually looked at him, because the quality of the silence around her changed slightly, the way it does when a person is trying to be polite but cannot quite manage to be invisible. He was tall in the way of men who have spent time carrying things, broad across the chest, with dark hair that curled a little at the collar and a jaw that carried 2 days of shadow. His eyes were a deep amber brown that caught the afternoon light in a way she found immediately inconvenient. He was holding a horse brush in one hand and looking at Calla with a professional concern that told her exactly who he was before he said a word. "She pushed hard to get here," he said. Not a question. He was looking at the mare's legs. 3 days from outside Amarillo, Inez said. He crouched and ran a hand down Calla's near foreleg with the gentle authority of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "No damage, but she needs rest and good hay for a couple days. I've got a stall. He stood and looked at her then, directly and without apology, and there was nothing rude in it. It was just the look of a man who paid attention. "August Thatcher, I run the livery." "I know," she said, which surprised him slightly. She could tell by the small shift in his expression. "I was told to find you if I needed anything. Inez Lawson. I am here to take possession of some property my father bought before he died." Something moved across his face at the word died, something careful and respectful. He did not offer empty condolences, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He simply nodded and said, "I know the property, the old birch place just east of the ridge. Your father wrote to a few people here when he bought it. He had plans." The word plans hit her harder than she expected, and she looked away at the water trough and breathed through it. When she looked back at him, he was still watching her with that same attentive quiet. "How much for the stall?" she asked. "For tonight, nothing," he said. "You have just ridden 3 days alone across the panhandle. Let us start with that." She wanted to argue. She was not good at receiving things without paying for them. But she was also tired in a way that lived behind her eyes and in her shoulders and somewhere deeper than that, and she recognized that this was not the moment for pride. "Thank you," she said. He took Calla's reins gently, and the mare, who did not usually trust strangers with her face, allowed it without complaint. Inez watched him lead her horse into the livery and felt something settle in her chest that she did not examine too closely. She found her cousin, a round-faced woman named Dottie Marsh, at the hotel, where Dottie worked behind the front desk with the cheerful efficiency of someone who genuinely liked people. Dottie had known Inez as a child and received the news of Harlan Lawson's death with real sorrow, pulling Inez into a fierce hug that smelled like rosewater and bread dough. "You will stay with me until the house is ready," Dottie said firmly. It was not a question. "The house might be ready now," Inez said. "I have not seen it." "Then tomorrow we go see it together," Dottie said, in exactly the same tone. Inez stayed at the hotel that night in a small room with a real bed, and she lay on top of the quilt and stared at the ceiling and thought about her father, about the way he had laughed, about the 2 riders from the Caldwell Land Consortium, about the fact that no one had been held accountable, about the letter in her saddlebag that was actually the deed to the property, and about the way August Thatcher had put his hand on Calla's leg with such gentleness. She was asleep before she had finished thinking about any of it. In the morning, Dottie made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and eggs with dried peppers, and she talked while Inez ate, filling her in on Harlan Creek with the brisk thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting to do exactly this. There was the sheriff, a man named Cord Ellison, who was competent and fair. There was the doctor, Wallace Pete, who was indeed not drunk most of the time. There was the church, which was non-denominational and well-attended. There was a school. There was the Caldwell Land Consortium, which owned the stage depot and 3 of the largest ranches in the county, and had been buying up land with a persistence that made some of the older families nervous. Inez set down her coffee cup. "The Caldwell Land Consortium," she said. Dottie looked at her. "You know the name." "They are the ones who killed my father," Inez said. The kitchen went very quiet. Dottie sat down slowly. "Inez, 2 of their riders, my father would not sell to them. He had written to tell me about the pressure they were putting on him. And then," she stopped, "and then they stopped putting pressure on him." Dottie reached across the table and covered Inez's hand with both of hers. "Does Sheriff Ellison know?" "He knows what I know, which is that 2 men rode onto the property and one of them fired a shot. I could not identify them with certainty. I was inside the house and I heard it and I came out and my father was already on the ground." She said it in an even voice because she had found that the even voice was the only way she could say it at all. Dottie's eyes were full. "We will tell Cord everything, and you are not alone here. Do you understand me? You are not alone." The Birch place was a solid 2-room house with a loft, set back from a dirt track that wound up from the main road into the shelter of the ridge. The previous owner had left in a hurry 4 years ago and the house had stood empty since, but it was structurally sound. The windows needed new glass in 2 places. The stove needed cleaning. The roof over the linta had partially collapsed, but the walls were straight and the floor was level and the fireplace drew cleanly. And when Inez stood in the main room and looked out through the intact window at the valley below, she felt something that was close to the specific relief of recognizing a place she belonged. She went back to town and spoke to Sheriff Cord Ellison that afternoon. He was a lean man in his 40s with tired eyes and a careful manner, and he listened to everything she said without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Caldwell Consortium has been buying land in this county for 2 years," he said. "I know they applied pressure to your father. I did not know it had gone that far." He tapped his fingers on the desk. "I am going to need more than what you have told me if I want to move on this officially, but I want you to know that I am listening and that I take this seriously." It was not justice. It was not enough. But it was something, and Inez thanked him and walked back out into the bright, cold afternoon. August Thatcher was outside the livery, repairing a section of fence rail when she walked past. He looked up from his work. "How is the house?" he asked. She stopped because it was a genuine question and deserved a genuine answer. "Needs work, but it is solid. I think it can be made into something good." "What kind of work?" "Windows, the linta roof, the stove." He set down the fence rail. "I know a bit about construction, and I know who in town does good work on stoves. If you want, I can come out tomorrow and look at the lean-to. I would rather see what is needed before I offer to help, so I am not making promises I cannot keep." She looked at him. He was straightforward in a way she had not encountered much in recent weeks, and it disarmed her more than she wanted to admit. "Why would you do that?" she asked, not ungratefully. She genuinely wanted to know. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "'Cause your father bought that land with good intentions and he is not here to see them through. And because you rode here alone from Amarillo and you are going to try to do this by yourself if no one steps in, and that is both admirable and unnecessary when there are people around who can help." She was quiet for a moment. "You knew my father. We exchanged a few letters. He wrote when he bought the property, asking about the town and the people and whether it was a good place for his daughter." He paused. He seemed like a man who thought carefully about everything. Inez looked away at the mountains in the distance, blue and still. "He was," she said. The next morning August rode out to the property in his wagon, which was loaded with tools and a length of new timber. He was there before Inez arrived, which she discovered when she crested the track on Cala and found him already standing at the corner of the linta with his hands on his hips, studying the collapsed section with the focused attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. She dismounted and stood beside him, and they both looked at the damage without speaking for a moment. "The main support posts are fine," he said. "It is just the crossbeams that went, probably under snow load 2 or 3 winters ago. This is a half-day's work if we both do it." She looked at him. "I have never raised a roof." "You are about to," he said simply. It turned out she was good at it. She had her father's practicality and his willingness to learn without pretending she already knew things, and August was a patient teacher who explained everything once and then let her do it, watching quietly in case she needed help but not hovering. By noon they had the new crossbeams up and the timber laid. By mid-afternoon the linta had a roof again, and Inez was sitting on the ground outside the house with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out, covered in sawdust, and feeling better than she had in weeks. August sat down a few feet away, eating the biscuits he had brought in a cloth. He offered her one and she took it. "Thank you," she said. "You did half the work," he said. "I meant for coming. You did not have to." He ate the biscuit and looked out at the valley. The afternoon light was making the grass look like copper wire. "I know I did not have to," he said. "That is not the same as not wanting to." She looked at him sideways. He was looking out at the valley with that same quiet attention he gave everything, and she felt that inconvenient feeling again, the one she had decided not to examine. She examined it anyway, briefly, and then put it away somewhere safer. Over the next 2 weeks, she worked the house into something livable. She bought glass for the windows from the hardware store and set it herself. She cleaned the stove with Dottie's instructions and a great deal of wire wool and determination. She brought her few things from the hotel and arranged them in the rooms with a care that was really about building a life again from a very small beginning. August came by 4 more times in those 2 weeks. Once with a bag of oats for Calla, because he had noticed she was running low. Once to help her hang the heavier of the 2 interior doors that had warped off its hinges. Once just to bring her news from town, which was how she learned that the Caldwell consortium had made an offer on the Morrison property at the north end of the valley. And once, toward the end of the 2nd week, with no stated reason at all, just his horse tied to the fence post and himself leaning against the porch rail when she came back from town with supplies. "You are here," she said. "I am," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. "Would you like to come in? I made bread this morning, and it is better than I expected." He smiled then, for the first time she had seen, and it changed his face completely, made him look younger and easier, and she thought that was probably the most dangerous thing about him. The bread was indeed good, and they sat at her small table and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours. She learned that he had come to Harlan Creek 8 years ago from Missouri, where he had grown up working his uncle's horses. He had bought the livery when its previous owner had decided to go to California, and he had built it into a real operation, 12 stalls, a forge he had added himself, a good reputation for fair prices and honest work. He had not married. He said this plainly, without elaborating, and she did not press. She told him about Fort Worth, where she had studied at a school for young women with a curriculum that was more rigorous than most people assumed, covering literature and arithmetic and practical arts. She told him about coming home to Amarillo when her father's health had started to concern her, and about the months she had spent there before everything happened. She did not tell him all the details of her father's death. She had told the details to Sheriff Ellison, and they lived there now, in that office, where they were supposed to eventually become evidence. But August seemed to understand, in the way he understood most things, that there was a shape to what she was telling him and a shape to what she was not, and he respected both. "What are you going to do with the 20 acres?" he asked. She had been thinking about this. "My father had chickens and a vegetable garden at the Amarillo place. I can do that. Sell eggs and produce to the hotel and the boarding house. Maybe expand." He was going to try cattle eventually, just a small herd. "The grazing land on the east side of your property is good," August said. "Not the biggest range, but enough for a small operation." "Do you know cattle?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "I know horses better." "But yes," she looked at him across the table, "you seem to know a great deal about quite a few things." "I have been paying attention for 31 years," he said. "Some of it has stuck." 31, she thought, 8 years older than her. Old enough to know himself, young enough that the world had not finished with him yet. She cleared the coffee cups and he stood to go, and at the door he turned and looked at her in that direct way he had. "Are you all right out here alone?" he asked. "Not because I think you cannot handle it, but because I would like to know." She considered being evasive and decided against it. "Some nights are hard," she said. "Grief does not keep regular hours. But the house is good. And this is what my father wanted for me, so there is something in that." He nodded. He put on his hat. He said, "Good night, Inez," and went down the steps to his horse. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride until the dark swallowed him, and she thought that she would need to be more careful than this if she was going to manage being in the same town as August Thatcher for any length of time. The trouble with the Caldwell Land Consortium came back into her life on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after she arrived in Harlan Creek. She was in the dry goods store buying salt when she overheard 2 men talking in the next aisle. They were speaking quietly but not quietly enough, and one of them was describing a conversation he had witnessed between the consortium's local agent, a man named Gerald Prout, and someone he referred to only as the sheriff's deputy. The words she caught were, "Lawson Place and make it difficult, and she will sell if it gets uncomfortable enough." She set down her salt very carefully and walked around to the next aisle. The two men were middle-aged, both strangers to her. They looked up with the startled guilt of people who had been caught doing something they had not quite acknowledged to themselves was wrong. "What did you just say?" Inez asked. The taller of the two started to speak. She cut him off. "About my property. What did you just say about my property and making things uncomfortable?" The shorter one, who had a mustache that he was clearly not proud of, said, "Miss, we are just repeating what we heard. We don't work for Prout." "Who does?" she said. "The deputy." They exchanged a look. "There is talk," the taller one said carefully, "that Prout has been paying a couple of people for information and sometimes for other things. We do not know if the deputy is one of them." "That is just the name we heard." Inez bought her salt and walked directly to August's livery. He listened to everything she said with his full attention, leaning against the stable door with his arms crossed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Prout has been here for a year," he said. "He came ahead of the consortium's main operation. He is not a violent man himself, but he has money and he is not particular about how he uses it." "What do I do?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "First, you go to Cord Ellison and you tell him about the deputy. Cord is a good man, and if someone on his staff is taking money from Prout, he would want to know. Second, you document everything. Write down what you heard when you heard it, who said it. Third," he paused, "you do not go back to that property alone tonight." She looked at him. "Where do you suggest I go?" "Dottie's," he said immediately. "Or here, I have a room above the livery that I use when I need to work early. It is plain, but it is safe and nobody would think to look for you there." There was nothing inappropriate in the offer. His tone made that completely clear. It was as practical as everything else about him. "I am not going to hide from Gerald Prout," she said. "You are not hiding," he said. "You are being intelligent. There is a difference." She went to Cord Ellison. The sheriff's expression during her account moved through several stages, and by the end of it he looked like a man who had just been told that a tooth he had been worrying at was actually rotten all the way through. "The deputy's name is Haskell," he said quietly. "I did not know the name," she said. "You did not need to. I have had a feeling about him for a while." He stood up. "Miss Lawson, I am going to ask you to stay in town tonight. I am going to have a conversation with Haskell, and I am going to find out what he knows about Prout's plans for your property. And if he does not tell you," Ellison looked at her with those tired, careful eyes, "then I am going to go find Prout myself." She stayed at Dottie's that night. Dottie fed her chicken stew and talked about normal things with great deliberateness, which was a kindness Inez recognized and accepted. She slept badly and woke before dawn to the sound of horses moving fast on the main street, and she lay in the dark and waited. In the morning, Ellison found her at the hotel before she had finished breakfast. "Haskell is gone," he said. "Took his horse and his belongings sometime in the night. My guess is Prout warned him that I was asking questions, but I found something useful before he left." He set a folded paper on the table in front of her. "Haskell had a receipt from Prout, payment for services. It is not everything, but it is something, and it is enough for me to move on Prout officially." Inez looked at the receipt, then she looked at Ellison. "My father's killers were working for Prout's organization," she said. "I know," he said, "and I have written to the Amarillo authorities with what you have given me and what I have found here. It is going to take time. I will not lie to you about that, but it will not be nothing. It was not justice yet. But it was the machinery of justice beginning to move, and she held on to that." She told August that afternoon. They were walking along the main street, which had become a pattern she had not consciously established, but which seemed to have established itself anyway. He listened, nodded, and said, "Ellison will see it through. He is not a man who leaves things half done." "I just want it to be settled," she said. "All of it. My father deserves that." "He does," August said. He said it simply, and she believed him completely. They were walking past the church when she stopped and looked up at the plain wooden steeple. "I have not been inside yet," she said. "Do you want to?" She thought about it. "Not today, but sometime." He looked at the steeple too. Then he said, with a casualness that was clearly not casual at all, "There is something I want to ask you, and I am going to ask it plainly because that is the only way I know how to do anything." She looked at him. Her heart did something it had no business doing. "I would like to take you to dinner at the hotel," he said, "not as a neighborly gesture or because I am trying to help you settle in, as something that is more than that. If you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching and without pretending he had not just said what he had said. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He smiled that smile that changed his face, and this time she did not look away from it. They had dinner at the hotel on Saturday evening. Dottie, who was on duty at the front desk, looked at the two of them walking in together and had the grace to keep her expression entirely professional for nearly 3 full seconds before the smile broke through. Inez gave her a look and Dottie looked at the ceiling. The dining room was warm and lamplit, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window and ordered the roasted beef and the corn bread and a shared apple pie for after. They talked differently than they had before. Not more easily exactly, but more honestly, which was not quite the same thing. There was a kind of a tension between them now that had been acknowledged and named, and it made everything feel more deliberate. He told her about Missouri again, but this time in more detail. About his father, who had been a difficult man in specific ways he was still untangling. About his mother, who had died when he was 14, and whom he still missed in the occasional precise way of someone who has learned to carry a loss carefully. About why he had left and how Harlan Creek had been, at first, just a stopping point that had become a home. She told him about Fort Worth, but this time the part she had not told him before, about the books she had loved, about a teacher who had told her that women who asked too many questions were going to make everyone around them very tired, and how she had taken that as encouragement, about the life she had imagined for herself before Amarillo had pulled her back and everything had changed. "What did that life look like?" he asked. "Something like this, actually," she said. She looked at the window and the dark town outside it. Land, a house that was mine, work that was real and visible. I just did not expect to come to it this way. "Grief changes the route," he said, "not the destination." She looked at him. "That is a very good thing to say." "I have been thinking it for a while," he admitted. "Waiting for the right moment." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, because it was real and uncomplicated, and she had not laughed like that in 2 months. He looked delighted, as though he had found something he had not been sure existed. After dinner they walked back along the main street in the cold, their breath making small clouds, and at the turning where the road split toward her property, he stopped. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight from the hardware store window, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something else, something that would require her to reorganize a great deal of what she was currently thinking. But he just tipped his hat and said good night, and she rode home under a sky that was absolutely crowded with stars and thought about him the entire way. The following weeks had a quality to them that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not because they were dramatic, though some of them were, but because they were full. She got her chickens from a farmer named Holt who sold her 6 laying hens and a rooster of considerable personality. She planted the winter garden and started planning the spring one. She attended the church on 2 Sundays and found it unexpectedly comforting. She got to know the town in the incremental way you do when you are actually living in a place and not just passing through, learning people's names and their habits and the small courtesies that hold a community together. And she saw August, almost every day in one way or another. He came by the property to check the fence line on the east pasture, which he said was her father's original survey boundary, and would matter when she started thinking about cattle. They rode out together one Sunday morning to look at a small herd that a rancher named Dubos was willing to sell in part, and August talked her through what to look for with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted her to understand and not just to be helped. She started to understand the shape of him. He was not an easy man in the sense of being simple or uncomplicated. He had opinions and he held them clearly, but he was always willing to be shown something he had not considered. He had a temper that he kept on a very short leash. She saw it once when a man at the hardware store spoke to her with a dismissiveness that was meant to be charming and was not, and August's jaw set in a way that took about 15 minutes to ease back. He was private about certain things in a way she respected, because she was private about certain things too. He was also, she had come to realize, paying attention to her in a way that nobody had ever quite managed before. Not just to what she said, but to what she was thinking about saying. It was the most intimate kind of attention, and it made her feel simultaneously very seen and very vulnerable. On an evening in late November, about 6 weeks after the hotel dinner, they were sitting on her porch in the cold with blankets and coffee, which had become something they did without formally deciding to. The stars were out and the valley below was very quiet. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When you first rode into town," he said, "with your father's coat and your back straight like you were daring anyone to notice that you had been through something terrible, I thought two things. The first was that you were the most determined person I had ever seen. The second was that I wanted very much to know you." She held her coffee cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it. "And now that I do know you," he said, "I find that I want to keep knowing you for a very long time." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that direct, undefended look that was the most him thing about him. "August," she said carefully, "I am a woman who has just lost her father and ridden across the panhandle alone and is still in the middle of a legal situation and is trying to build something from essentially nothing. I am not an easy proposition." "I know," he said. "I am not asking for easy, I am asking for you." She was quiet for a long time. The cold pressed around them and the stars were very clear. "I feel things when I am around you," she said finally, "that I was not planning on feeling for a long time." "Is that a problem?" he asked. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. He nodded, accepting this without disappointment. That acceptance was, she realized, a large part of what the problem was. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "Take the time you need." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He turned his palm up and held her hand, and they sat like that in the cold looking at the stars, and she thought that she was probably not going to need as much time as she had implied. She was right. It was December when she knew with certainty, though she suspected she had known earlier and had simply been being honest with herself about the complicated timing of it. She knew it on a Wednesday when Cord Ellison came to her property to tell her that the Amarillo authorities, working with the information she and Ellison had compiled, had identified and arrested the two men responsible for her father's death. They were being held for trial. Gerald Prout, implicated in the arrangement of the killing, was being investigated. It would take time and the outcome was not guaranteed, but the machinery was moving. She sat down on the porch steps when Ellison told her this and cried. Not the careful, managed grief she had been carrying. Real tears from the bottom of it, because this was the beginning of something being answered and she had not let herself believe it would come. Ellison waited respectfully and at a decent distance until she was done. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting it sit. It was your information that made it possible," he said. "You did the hard part." After he left, she saddled Calla and rode to the livery. August was inside, working on a harness repair, and he looked up when she walked in, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down the harness immediately. "The men who killed my father have been arrested," she said. He crossed the livery to her in 3 strides and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held for the first time since any of this had started, and she held on to him with her face against his shoulder and breath through it until the shaking stopped. He did not say anything for a while. He just held her steadily, the way he did everything, with complete attention and without making her feel like the duration of her need was a problem. When she finally lifted her head, she found she was looking directly at him from about 4 inches away, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, quietly and with complete certainty, "I am done taking time." He searched her face once. Then he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning so much as an arrival, a place that has existed for a while finally being named. She kissed him back without reservation, and the harness on the floor and the horses in their stalls and the cold December day outside were all completely irrelevant. December in Harlan Creek was both beautiful and demanding. The valley collected snow in long, soft drifts along the fences, and the ridgeline turned white against a sky that alternated between hard blue and the soft gray of coming storms. Inez kept her chickens warm in the lean-to, which now had its good roof, and she learned to manage the stove with wood she had spent 3 weeks stacking with Dottie's husband, a quiet, capable man named Leo who did everything at a pace that suggested he intended to do it right. She and August moved through the town together now in a way that was unmistakable and that neither of them bothered to obscure. They were not dramatic about it. There was no announcement. But in a small town, the shift from two people who were clearly interested to two people who have clearly arrived at something together is visible in the way they stand near each other and the way each of them speaks about the other to anyone who asks. Dottie, for her part, was entirely incapable of being subtle and did not try. She asked Inez approximately 15 questions on the morning after the livery, with an enthusiasm that was completely genuine and only slightly exhausting, and Inez answered most of them and deflected the rest with the skill of a woman who had grown up near someone like Dottie. "He is a good man," Dottie said firmly, as though there had been a debate about this. "I know," Inez said. "He has been on his own for a long time. He needed someone who would see him properly." Inez thought about this. "I think he was doing quite well on his own," she said. "He does not need me to complete him." Dottie waved a hand. "Of course not, but wanting someone is different from needing someone. One is better." Inez thought Dottie was right about that. Christmas came with a quiet ceremony at the church and a town dinner in the hotel dining room that half of Harlan Creek attended. Inez sat next to August and across from the Ellisons, and the evening had the warm, ordinary loveliness of belonging somewhere. She thought about her father throughout the dinner, steadily and without the acute pain that had accompanied the thought of him for months. She thought about him with love and with grief and with something that was beginning to approach peace. After dinner, walking home in the snow with August beside her, she said, "He would have liked this town." "I think he knew he would," August said. "That is why he bought the land." She stopped in the middle of the road, snow falling around them, and looked up at him. "He bought it for me," she said. "Yes," August said. He was looking at her with that focused, unhurried attention, snowflakes catching on his dark hair. "He did." She reached up and held his face in her cold hands and kissed him in the middle of the road with the snow coming down, and he laughed against her mouth and held her around the waist and kissed her back, and a couple of voices from the hotel porch behind them made encouraging sounds that she chose to be deaf to. January brought a hard freeze and then a thaw and then a hard freeze again, which was the panhandle's way of reminding everyone that it made the rules. Inez learned to read the sky in the specific way of people who depend on weather for their livelihood, looking for the particular light that meant more snow coming, and the specific quality of the wind that meant it would hold. She had written to the Amarillo Bank about her father's estate, which was modest but real, and a settlement had been reached that, combined with the property and what she was beginning to earn from her eggs and early produce, meant she was genuinely solvent. Not comfortable in the way of people who have never had to count, but solvent in the way of someone who knows exactly what she has and has a clear plan for what to do with it. In February, she bought 4 head of cattle from Dubos, a small, cautious beginning, and August helped her build the necessary fencing on the east pasture over 2 weekends. They worked in the cold with their breath clouding and the ground iron hard, and at the end of the second weekend she made stew for both of them, and they sat at her table with the fire going and were very tired and very content. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," she said. He looked at her over his bowl. "That is a significant request." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I came very close to leaving Harlan Creek 3 years ago," he said. "The livery had a bad year and I was tired in a way that was more than just physical, and I thought about Missouri, about whether I had made the right choice." "What kept you?" he considered. "A man named Birch." "The man who owned your property before you. He was leaving and he came to say goodbye and he said to me, he said, "August, you have built a real thing here and real things do not transfer." He meant the reputation of the livery, the relationships I had made, but I think he meant more than that. He looked at his bowl. "So I stayed." She looked at him across the table. "I am very glad you stayed," she said. He looked at her. "So am I," he said, "more than I could have known at the time." Spring came to the valley in the way it does in the panhandle, not gently but with a kind of urgent determination, green appearing overnight in the pasture, and the creek running high with snowmelt. Inez planted her full garden and watched her hens with the satisfaction of someone who has built a small system and seen it work. The cattle were doing well. She had been talking to a man named Cassidy about buying 2 more head in the summer. The trial for her father's killers was set for June in Amarillo. Ellison told her she might be called as a witness, and she said she was prepared. Gerald Pruitt's case was still being assembled, which Ellison acknowledged was slower than anyone wanted, but the charges were serious and the evidence was building. On an April afternoon with the cottonwoods just coming into leaf and the sky a bright, uncomplicated blue, August rode out to her property with a formality in his bearing that she had not seen before, and that made her set down the seed tray she was carrying and look at him with full attention. He dismounted and tied his horse, and came to stand in front of her with his hat in his hands, which was a significant gesture from a man who was generally not demonstrative about gesture. "I have something to ask you," he said. She folded her hands in front of her. She kept her face as calm as she could manage, which was not very calm at all. "I have been thinking about how to say this in a way that is worthy of you," he said, "and I have concluded that there is probably no way to do that, so I'm just going to say it the way I think it, which is directly." "Please," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for longer than I have admitted to myself, and I would like very much, if you are willing, to ask you to marry me. Not because the land would make more sense together, though it would. Not because it would be practical, though it is. But because you are the person I want to be with for all of it. The difficult parts and the good parts and the ordinary parts that make up most of a life. Because when I think about the future, you are in it, and that is not something that has been true for me before." He stopped. He looked at her with everything visible without the usual careful management, just August entirely there in the April light with his hat in his hands. She was crying. She had not decided to cry and she was mildly annoyed about it, but she was doing it anyway. "Yes," she said. "August, yes, of course, yes." He let out a breath and then he smiled, that full, transforming smile, and she stepped forward and he put his arms around her and held her the way he had in the livery months ago, but different now because this time it was not just comfort, it was permanence. It was the specific feeling of choosing something completely. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "I should have said that sooner." "You said it exactly when it needed to be said," he replied. They were married in June at the church in Harlan Creek on a morning when the whole valley was warm and the cottonwoods were fully green. Dottie cried elaborately and made no attempt to hide it. Leo shook August's hand with great sincerity. Cord Ellison and his wife sat in the third row. The minister, a tall, gentle man named Reverend Carr, read the vows in a voice that carried easily through the small church. Inez wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself with Dottie's help, with small buttons up the back and a lace collar that had been her mother's. She carried a small bunch of flowers from her own garden. August was in his good suit, the dark one, with a clean shirt and his dark hair combed back. He looked at her when she came down the aisle with the same complete attention he gave everything, but multiplied, and she thought she had never been so seen in her entire life. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but she meant every word with a specificity that made them feel newly written. To have and to hold, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others. She looked at him when she said them and he looked at her, and Dottie made a sound from the third row that was technically classified as a controlled sob. After the ceremony there was a dinner in the hotel, expanded to fill the whole dining room, and half the town came. There was music from a fiddle player and a man with a guitar, and people danced, and Inez danced with August in the way of two people who do not do a great deal of dancing, but are doing this particular dancing for the right reasons, which makes up for a great deal. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone home and the fiddle had been put away, and the remains of the dinner were being cleared, Inez and August sat together at the corner table with the last of the coffee, and he had his arm around her and she had her head on his shoulder, and neither of them was saying anything because nothing needed to be said. Dottie appeared, having apparently cried herself down to a kind of peaceful glow, and said, "You are absolutely the two most suited people I have ever put in the same room." "You did not put us in the same room," Inez said. "I rode 3 days across the panhandle. And I was standing right there," August added. "I take full credit," Dottie said, and sailed off into the kitchen. The trial in Amarillo took place in late June, and Inez went with August, riding the train for the first time in her life on a line that had recently extended to within 40 miles of Harlan Creek. She testified clearly and without apparent emotion, though August, sitting in the gallery, could see the effort that composure cost her. She described what she had seen and heard on the morning her father died, and she did it with precision because she had kept every detail sharp by going over it regularly in the private practice of someone who knows that the truth must be kept clean to be useful. The two men were convicted. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The sentences were significant. Inez stood outside the courthouse afterward in the Amarillo heat with August beside her and looked at the familiar sky above a city she had once called home, and she felt the grief settle into something different, something that could be carried differently. Not resolved, because grief does not resolve, but weighted differently. Answered. "He would have been proud of you," August said. "He would have liked you," she said. "I hope so." "He would have," she said with certainty. "He liked straightforward people. He liked people who did what they said." Gerald Pruitt's case resolved in September, when a court in Amarillo found him liable for conspiracy in the arrangement of Harold Lawson's death. He was sentenced to prison, and his position with the Caldwell Land Consortium was dissolved. The consortium itself, facing increasing legal scrutiny in several counties, began withdrawing from the region. Their land interests in Harlan Creek were put up for sale, and some of the families they had pressured were able to buy back at reasonable prices. It was not a complete righting of wrongs. It was not justice in the absolute sense that she had wanted in those first terrible days. But it was substantial, and it was documented, and it was permanent, and she took it. The autumn of 1883 passed into the autumn of a new routine. Inez had moved her things fully to the Birch Place, which nobody called the Birch Place anymore. They called it the Thatcher Place, or because Inez had made it abundantly clear that she was keeping her father's name in any context she chose, the Lawson Thatcher Place, which August said he preferred anyway because it was more accurate. August kept the livery, riding in each morning and returning each evening, though he had also taken on more of the work at the property, helping with the cattle operation as it slowly expanded. They had settled into a partnership that was practical and also something much more than practical, the daily business of two people who have decided to pay attention to each other for the rest of their lives. She loved the mornings most. The specific quality of the early light in the valley, the way the chickens organized themselves with their unironic confidence, August coming down from the loft he used as a dressing room with his coffee already in hand, stopping to look out the window at the pasture with the same quiet attention he gave everything. She loved that they had developed the private language of people who live together, the shorthand gestures and the particular silences that mean different things from the same silences with strangers. She also loved that they still surprised each other. That was not a small thing. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with the complete casualness of someone who has been thinking very carefully about how to say something and has decided that the direct approach is the only one that will work. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment, and she watched his face move through several things. "Are you all right?" he asked first, which was exactly the right first question, and she loved him for it. Yes, she said. Healthy. Dottie's already fussing. Of course she is, he said. He stood up and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with that full, unguarded look she had first seen in the livery on a cold December evening. Inez, he said. I know, she said. A person, he said, with the specific wonder of someone encountering an idea for the first time despite its logical inevitability. Apparently, she agreed. He laughed and kissed her and held her, and she laughed too, and the chickens outside the window carried on with their mourning as though this were not a significant development. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Inez attributed to the fact that she had been hauling fence posts and managing cattle right up until Dr. Pete suggested she take things at a slightly reduced pace, which she interpreted as a personal recommendation and modified accordingly. August was attentive without being overwhelming about it, which was the correct calibration of attentiveness, and she told him so. I have been paying attention, he said. You do not want to be managed. I absolutely do not want to be managed, she confirmed. But you do not mind being cared for, he said. She considered this. When it is you doing it, she said. No. In October of 1884, on a night when the first frost of the season had just touched the valley, Inez gave birth to a son. He was born in the bedroom of the Lawson Thatcher house with Dr. Pete in attendance and Dottie stationed outside the door, ready to be either useful or emotional depending on what was needed. He was a solid, loud, apparently healthy boy with a great deal of dark hair and an immediate opinion about the world, which he expressed continuously for the first hour of his life. August held him with the careful astonishment of a man holding a very small and very important thing for the first time. He stood at the window with the baby against his chest and looked out at the frost-touched valley and then back at Inez in the bed, and she had never seen his face look quite like that. It was the face of someone whose understanding of what matters has just been clarified completely. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby, against all expectation, stopped making noise. "I am going to do my best," he said. "That is all I can promise." Inez watched this from the bed and felt something so large and full that she could not have named it, which she thought was probably the right response to the specific miracle of watching the person you love become a father. They named him Harold for her father. Harold August Thatcher was a person from the very beginning. He had his father's focused attention and his mother's quality of always looking just past the obvious thing to find what was actually interesting. By the time he was 18 months old, he was investigating the chickens with a scientific dedication that made the rooster extremely nervous and everyone else very entertained. Dottie adored him with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. Leo built him a wooden horse with wheels, which he dragged everywhere for 2 years. The town of Harlan Creek settled around the Lawson Thatcher family as towns do around families who have put down real roots. August's livery continued to grow, adding a 4th stall, and eventually, in 1886, a small blacksmith operation that served the community well. Inez's cattle herd was at 12 head by 1885, modest but steady, and her garden and chickens supplied the hotel and boarding house reliably. She had also started keeping records of her farming in a careful ledger, not just for her own accounts, but in a way that she sometimes shared with other small holders in the area who were working through similar questions. She was not trying to teach anyone, but people asked, and she answered, and gradually she became the person that new homesteaders came to when they had questions about which crops held up in the panhandle winters or which suppliers were honest. It was not a formal thing. It was just the natural accumulation of a reputation for knowing what she was talking about. August watched this with a quiet pride that she caught on his face occasionally and that he never tried to make into a speech about. "You are becoming indispensable," he said one evening. "I am becoming useful," she corrected, "which is what my father always told me to aim for." He was right, August said. In 1886, Gerald Prout died in prison. The news came to Harlan Creek in a letter to Ellison, who told Inez directly and with appropriate care. She was quiet about it for a day, and then she was all right. It did not resolve anything differently than the conviction had, but it closed a door, and there was something to be said for closed doors. The Caldwell Land Consortium had completely withdrawn from the region by then, their operation dismantled by the combined weight of legal action and the practical reality that the families they had tried to displace had stayed and built things that were not easily dislodged. Some of those families had bought pieces of the consortium's abandoned holdings at sale prices that felt like a small moral satisfaction. The decade turned. Harlan Creek grew. A second school was built on the south side of town. The railroad spur that had gotten within 40 miles of the town in 1883 reached Harlan Creek itself in 1889, changing the pace and scale of everything. August expanded the livery again and added a contract to supply horses to the railroad operation, which was significant enough to require a hired man. He found a good one in a young man named Torres who had grown up working horses in New Mexico and had the kind of easy skill with animals that could not be taught. Harold, at 5, was deeply interested in Torres and his stories about New Mexico, which Torres shared with great generosity while working. Inez watched this friendship across the age gap and thought about the way that knowledge moves between people when they are willing to share it. In the autumn of 1889, a second pregnancy announced itself with the same practical directness as the first, except that this time Inez told August in the middle of the pasture while they were checking the fence line, because that was where the moment happened and she had learned not to wait for the right setting. He stopped walking and looked at her. "Again," he said, with the same specific wonder. "Apparently we are doing this again," she said. He put his arm around her and kissed the side of her head, and she leaned into him briefly before stepping back to assess the fence post she had been checking. "The fence is fine," she said. "I know," he said. He was still looking at her with that look. "You can stop looking at me like that." "I cannot," he said without apology. She laughed. The valley was turning gold around them and the air smelled like autumn and the particular dry sweetness of the panhandle grass, and she thought that if her father could see this, he would be glad. He had bought this land for her, had seen something in it that she was still discovering. He had sent her here in a sense, though not in the way he had intended. She hoped he could see it. She thought on her better days that maybe he could. The second child arrived in the spring of 1890, a girl this time, with her mother's dark eyes and what appeared to be her own strong opinion about things from approximately the first hour. They named her Clara, for no one specific but for the quality of the name itself, which suited her. Harold, at 5.5, received his sister with the cautious respect of someone who has been warned extensively that this new person is going to change things, and who is reserving final judgment. He came around fairly quickly when it became apparent that Clara, from a very young age, found him specifically interesting, watching him with a focused attention that he found difficult not to respond to. August came home one evening that summer to find Harold in the kitchen, explaining the mechanics of the water pump to Clara, who was sitting in her cradle, and regarding him with an expression of solemn engagement. He stood in the doorway and listened to his son explain water pressure to an infant with the methodical patience of a person who takes the dissemination of information seriously. And then he went to find Inez and said, "He is teaching her about the water pump." She looked up from the bread she was making. "I know, she is 4 months old. He says she is paying attention." August was quiet for a moment. "She is," he said. Inez smiled. "Your son is very thorough." "He gets it from his mother," August said. "He gets the patience from you," she said. "The thoroughness is mine." August came to the table and kissed the top of her head and reached past her to take a piece of the bread dough, which she intercepted. He laughed and went back to the kitchen where Harold was now explaining rainfall and seemed to be making progress. The years settled into the good accumulation of a life built with intention. Harold grew into a boy who was serious and curious, and when the situation required it, possessed of his mother's implacable determination and his father's steady patience. He loved horses with a specificity that pleased August enormously, and by the time he was 8, he was working regularly with Tors in the livery after school, with a competence that Tors assessed honestly and found real. Clara grew into a child who was interested in everything simultaneously, and who had to be persuaded to sleep on the grounds that the day still had things happening. She had a quality of cheerful relentlessness that was entirely her own, and that Dottie declared was the best possible thing to put into the world. Inez, in the fall of 1892, sat on the porch of the Lawson Thatcher house in the late afternoon and looked at the valley that her father had bought and that she had built into something real. The cattle, 18 head now, were moving in the far pasture. The garden had come in well that year. The house behind her was warm and solid and full of the particular noise of 2 children and the evening sounds of a family at the end of a day. August came out and sat beside her. He had a cup of coffee in each hand and he gave her one, and she took it, and they sat in the autumn light with the valley going golden below them. "Do you remember the first morning I rode in?" she said. "You let Calla drink at the trough," he said, "and you looked at the town like you were deciding whether to stay." "I had already decided," she said. "I just did not know it yet." He looked at her sideways with that small smile that was specifically hers and that he did not give to just anyone. "I know," he said. "I could tell." She leaned against his shoulder. The air smelled like autumn and wood smoke and the particular clarity of the panhandle sky going toward evening. Below them in the pasture, the cattle moved with their steady bovine purpose, and from inside the house came the sound of Harold explaining something to Clara, who was responding with the intensity of someone who is actually listening. "He is a good teacher," August said, listening. "He learned from his father," she said. "He learned from both of us," August said. She thought about her father, the way she always did when the light was this particular quality and the day was settling into itself. She thought about him with gratitude now, more than grief, though the grief was still there in its correct proportion. He had bought this land for her. He had thought about her future with the careful love of a man who knew he might not see it himself. He had sent letters to a town he had never visited, asking about the people there, and one of the people he had written to had been standing at the water trough on the day she arrived. She did not know what she believed about how things arranged themselves. She was not sure the world was tidy enough for Providence, and she had seen enough evidence that it was not. But there were moments when the shape of things felt like it had a meaning, and this was one of those moments. "I want to tell you something," she said. August waited, which was one of the things she loved most about him. He always waited with his full attention. "I am happy," she said, "not despite everything, including it. My father built towards something and I am living in it and I am going to add to it and so are our children, and I have you." She paused. "I am trying to tell you that this is enough, more than enough, that I am not missing anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, I can see it." She looked at him. "Can you?" "Every day," he said. "It is one of the best things I have ever had the luck to watch." She held his hand and they sat in the evening light and listened to their children inside, and the valley spread out below them with all of its ordinary, extraordinary content, and the mountains in the distance were going blue and distant in the dusk, and the first star appeared above the western ridge, the one that always came first in the panhandle sky, reliable as anything. The door behind them opened and Harold came out, carrying Clara on his hip with the confidence of a 9-year-old who has decided he is competent at this, which he mostly was. "She wants to see the first star," Harold announced. Clara pointed at the sky with the urgency of someone presenting important information. "There it is," Inez said, pointing. "See." Clara looked where she was pointing and made a sound of profound satisfaction. August reached up and settled Clara against his other shoulder so she was looking over him at the sky, and Harold sat on the step below the 2 adults and they all looked west together, the 4 of them, as the light went from gold to copper to the first soft dark of evening, and the stars came out one by one above the valley that was theirs, that had been bought with love and kept with love and would be handed on with love. This was the life that Harold Lawson had crossed the panhandle to buy for his daughter, and it was, in every particular, exactly what he had hoped for her. She knew this with the certainty of someone who has read a man's intentions clearly enough to carry them forward into a future he could not reach. She carried it every day, and she was glad. The night came on gently and the stars multiplied above Harlan Creek, and inside the house the fire was burning clean, and the cattle settled in the pasture, and somewhere down the valley a coyote sang one long note and was quiet again. And Inez Thatcher, who had been Inez Lawson and would always be both, leaned against her husband's shoulder under the wide Texas sky and felt the particular peace of a person who has found their place in the world and knows, without doubt, that they intend to stay.